All right. Greetings and salutations. Another day, another dollar, another time working in the mines. I thought I would try something a little bit different today. So I'm trying to do these streams, these lunchtime streams, once a day. So far, it's been okay, uh, but I'm wary of. I don't want to be just blathering on just blathering about the same things over and over again, or feel that I'm repeating myself or boring everybody. So I'm trying to think of what different things could I do potentially on different days, just as they come up. I liked going to and checking out things on the OSR subreddit because I feel like that just it just brings up topics to talk about. Two, sometimes we uncover some resources. Something else that's kind of near and dear to my heart is the Appendix N material, right? All the kind of stuff that we use as inspirations. There was the famous Appendix N in the original Dungeon Master's Guide from first edition, and of course, folks have talked about their own Appendix N. I've done some videos on films so far, so I've done two of them. It's been a while. I should probably do another one, but stuff that's kind of my personal Appendix N. But I thought, well, why don't I look at some Appendix N material? So it so happens that I have the Collected Fantasies of Clark Asthon Smith in hand. And one of the things I was worried about when I was thinking about this topic was, what could I possibly get in trouble with from the YouTube gods or whom elsewhere? Right? I don't want to be impinging on someone else's copyright, but I'm about 1,000% sure the Clark Asthon Smith stuff, which I believe was published at the end of the 19th century, is firmly within public domain. I found one of the stories I picked out. I had read it before, and I read through it a little bit again this morning. So when I pop it up here, you'll see some of my highlights. I have the Kindle electronic edition through Kindle. Let's see, I'll bring it up. So I thought I would read the story, and you'll notice in here I have a ton of highlights that I've made of just stuff, whether it's just language. Well, it's mostly language. Just he has got these great descriptions. A lot of these stories of this time frame, you may notice, I'm not sure if there's a name for it. There probably is, but they're stories that are really about transmitting an idea. That idea can be a place, it can be a concept, it could be anything, really anything. But the point is that there's only the barest. Oh, my screen is dirty. There's only the just the barest amount of plot or other things there to wrap around this idea. And I think you'll find that in this story, in which if you even want to call it, I don't even know if it's enough to call it a plot, is really just a way of getting to, I imagine, this kind of scene that, as we'll read, it's a really strong scene in terms of the imagery, and just in terms of, it really does a great job painting this image. And I think that this short story is just all about just transmitting this description of this amazing place. And I thought we can look at it, because I think there are a lot of things in these stories, and this is not a news story, that can give inspiration, that I'm sure gave inspiration. And at the end, we can talk about, I'm not sure if there's certainly a creature in here, which I won't spoil. And I'm this creature probably did show up somewhere. Maybe it's famous and I'm unaware of it, but there's some interesting things. Of course, the idea is, well, what can we pull from the stuff into the game? So this is a little bit of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully it will go well, and I will do more of these. And this one, like I said, it has the benefit of being short. Well, I said like I said. I think I tend to say like I said a lot. And sometimes I think afterwards and I go, did I really say that earlier? But what I meant to say is, and I may have said before, I don't remember, is that this is a short. In terms of short stories, it's a short. I think in the Kindle mode, it on my phone, another place that comes up is, I don't know, 3 pages or so. So it is rather short, which is good, because reading for ages, and I don't know that I'm a great story reader. Let's get into it, and then we can talk about it. So this one's called The Abominations of Yondo. The sand of the desert of Yondo is not as the sand of other deserts, for Yondo lies nearest of all to the world's rim, and strange winds, blowing from a gulf no astronomer may hope to fathom, have sown its ruinous fields with the gray dust of corroding planets, the black ashes of extinguished suns. The dark, orb-like mountains which rise from its pitted and wrinkled plain are not all its own, for some are fallen asteroids half buried in that abysmal sand. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by the watchful gods of all proper and well-ordered lands. But there are no such gods in Yondo, or live the hoary genii of stars abolished, and decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. It was noon of a vernal day when I came forth from that interminable cactus forest in which the inquisitors of Ong had left me, and saw at my feet the gray beginnings of Yondo. I repeat, it was noon of a vernal day, but in that fantastic wood I had found no token or memory of spring, and the swollen, fulvous, dying and half-rotten growths through which I had pushed my way were like no other cacti, but bore shapes of abominations scarcely to be described. The very air was heavy with stagnant odors of decay, and leprous lichens mottled the black soil and russet vegetation with increasing frequency. Pale green vipers lifted their heads from prostrate cactus bowls and watched me with eyes of bright ochre that had no lids or pupils. These things had disquieted me for hours past, and I did not like the monstrous fungi, with hueless stems and nodding heads of poisonous mauve, which grew from the sodden lips of fetid tarns, and a sinister ripple spreading and fading on the yellow waters at my approach were not reassuring to one whose nerves were still taut from unmentionable tortures. Then, when even the blotched and sickly cacti became more sparse and stunted, and rills of ashen sand crept in among them, I began to suspect how great was the hatred my heresy had aroused in the priests of Ong, and to guess the ultimate malignancy of their vengeance. I will not detail the indiscretions which had led me, a careless stranger from far-off lands, into the power of those dreadful magicians and mysteriarchs who served the lion-headed Ong. These indiscretions, and the particulars of my arrest, are painful to remember, and least of all do I like to remember the racks of dragon gut strewn with powdered adamant, on which men are stretched naked, or that unlit room with 6-inch windows near the sill, where bloated corpse worms crawled in by hundreds from a neighboring catacomb. Sufficient to say that, after expending the resources of their frightful fantasy, my inquisitors had borne me blindfolded on camelback for incomputable hours, to leave me at morning twilight in that sinister forest. I was free, they told me, to go whither I would, and in token of the clemency of Ong, they gave me a loaf of coarse bread and a leathern bottle of rank water by way of provision. It was noon of the same day that I came to the desert of Yondo. So far, I had not thought of turning back, for all the horror of those rotting cacti, or the evil things that dwelt among them. Now I paused, knowing the abominable legend of the land to which I had come. For Yondo is a place where few have ventured wittingly and of their own accord. Fewer still have returned, babbling of unknown horrors and strange treasure, and the lifelong palsy which shakes their withered limbs. Together with mad gleam in their starting eyes beneath whitened brows and lashes, is not an incentive for others to follow in their footsteps. So it was that I hesitated on the verge of those ashen sands, and felt the tremor of a new fear in my wrenched vitals. It was dreadful to go on, and dreadful to go back, for I felt sure that the priests had made provision against the latter contingency. So, after a little, I went forward, sinking each step in a loathly softness, and followed by certain long-legged insects that I had met among the cacti. These insects were the color of a week-old corpse, and were as large as tarantulas, but when I turned and trod upon the foremost, a mephitic stench arose that was more nauseous even than their color. So, for the nonce, I ignored them as much as possible. Indeed, such things were minor horrors in my predicament. Before me, under a huge sun of sickly scarlet, Yondo reached interminable as the land of hashish dream against the black heavens. Far off, on the utmost rim, were those orb-like mountains of which I have told. But in between were awful blanks of gray desolation, and low, treeless hills like the backs of half-buried monsters. Struggling on, I saw great pits where meteors had sunk from sight, and diverse-colored jewels that I could not name glared or glistened from the dust. There were fallen cypresses that rotted by crumbling mausoleums, on whose lichen-blotted marble fat chameleons crept with royal pearls in their mouths. Hidden by the low ridges were cities of which no stela remained unbroken, immense and immemorial cities lapsing shard by shard, atom by atom, to feed infinities of desolation. I dragged my torture-weakened limbs over vast rubbish heaps that had once been mighty temples, and fallen gods frowned in rotting samite, or leered in riven porphyry at my feet. Over all was an evil silence, broken only by the satanic laughter of hyenas and the rustling of adders in thickets of dead thorn, or antique gardens given to the perishing nettle and fumitory. Topping one of the many round mound-like ridges, I saw the waters of a weird lake, unfathomably dark and green as malachite, and set with bars of profligate salt. These waters lay far beneath me in a cup-like basin, but almost at my feet on the wave-worn slopes were heaps of that ancient salt, and I knew that the lake was only the bitter and ebbing dregs of some former sea. Climbing down, I came to the dark waters, and began to lave my hands, but there was a sharp and corrosive sting in that immemorial brine, and I detested quickly, preferring the desert dust that had wrapped about me like a slow shroud. Here I decided to rest for a little, and hunger forced me to consume part of the meager and mocking fare with which I had been provided by the priests. It was my intention to push on, if my strength would allow, and reach the lands that lie to the north of Yondo. These lands are desolate indeed, but their desolation is of a more usual order than that of Yondo, and certain tribes of nomads have been known to visit them occasionally. If fortune favored me, I might fall in with one of these tribes. The scant fare revived me, and for the first time in weeks of which I had lost all reckoning, I heard the whisper of a faint hope. The corpse-colored insects had long since ceased to follow me, and so far, despite the eeriness of the sepulchral silence and the mounded dust of timeless ruin, I had been nothing half so horrible as those insects. I began to think that the terrors of Yondo were somewhat exaggerated. It was then that I heard a diabolic chuckle on the hillside above me. The sound began with a sharp abruptness that startled me beyond all reason, and continued endlessly, never varying its single note, like the mirth of some idiotic demon. I looked up and saw the mouth of a dark cave, fanged with green stalactites, which I had not perceived before. The sound appeared to come from within this cave. With a fearful intentness, I stared at the black opening. The chuckle grew louder, but for a while I could see nothing. At last I caught a whitish glimmer in the darkness. Then, with all the rapidity of a nightmare, a monstrous thing emerged. It had a pale, hairless, egg-shaped body, large as that of a gravid she-goat, and this body was mounted on 9 long, wavering legs with many flanges, like the legs of some enormous spider. The creature ran past me to the water's edge, and I saw that there were no eyes in its oddly sloping face, but 2 knife-like ears rose high above its head, and a thin, wrinkled snout hung down across its mouth, whose flabby lips, parted in that eternal chuckle, revealed rows of bat's teeth. It drank avidly of the bitter lake. Then, with thirst satisfied, it turned and seemed to sense my presence, for the wrinkled snout rose and pointed toward me, sniffing audibly. Whether the creature would have fled, or whether it meant to assail me, I do not know, for I could bear the sight no longer, but ran with trembling limbs amid the massive boulders and great bars of salt along the lake shore. Utterly breathless, I stopped at last, and saw that I was not pursued. I sat down, still trembling in the shadow of a boulder, but I was to find little respite, for now began the second of those bizarre adventures which forced me to believe all the mad legends I had heard. More startling even than that diabolic chuckle was the scream that rose at my very elbow from the salt-compounded sand, the scream of a woman possessed by some atrocious agony or helpless in the grip of devils. Turning, I beheld a veritable Venus, naked in a white perfection that could fear no scrutiny, but immersed to her navel in the sand. Her terror-widened eyes implored me, and their lotus hands reached out with beseeching gesture. I sprang to her side, and touched a marble statue, whose carven lids were drooped in some enigmatic dream of dead cycles, and whose hands were buried with the lost loveliness of hips and thighs. Again I fled, shaken with a new fear, and again I heard the scream of a woman's agony, but I did not turn once more to see the imploring eyes and hands. Upon the long slope to the north of that accursed lake, stumbling over boulders of basanite and ledges that were sharp with verdigris-covered metals, floundering in pits of salt or innominable ashes, on terraces wrought by the receding tide in ancient eons, I fled as a man flees from dream to baleful dream of some cacodemoniacal night. Whew, that was a tough one. At whiles there was a cold whisper in my ear, which did not come from the wind of my flight, and looking back as I reached one of the upper terraces, I perceived a singular shadow that ran pace by pace with my own. This shadow was not the shadow of man, nor ape, nor any known beast. The head was too grotesquely elongated, the squat body too gibbous, and I was unable to determine whether the shadow possessed 5 legs or what appeared to be the 5th was merely a tail. Terror lent me new strength, and I had reached the hilltop when I dared to look back again. But still the fantastic shadow kept pace by pace with mine, and now I caught a curious and utterly sickening odor, foul as the odor of bats who have hung in a charnel house amid the mold of corruption. I ran for leagues, while the red sun slanted above the asteroidal mountains to the west, and the weird shadow lengthened with mine but always kept at the same distance behind me. An hour before sunset, I came to a circle of small pillars that rose miraculously unbroken amid ruins that were like a vast pile of potsherds. As I passed among these pillars, I heard a whimper, like the whimper of some fierce animal, between rage and fear, and saw that the shadow had not followed me within the circle. I stopped and waited, conjecturing at once that I had found a sanctuary my unwelcome familiar would not dare to enter. And in this the action of the shadow confirmed me. The thing hesitated, then ran about the circle of columns, pausing often between them, and whimpering all the while. At last went away and disappeared in the desert toward the setting sun. For a full half hour I did not dare to move. Then the imminence of night, with all its probabilities of fresh terror, urged me to push on as far as I could to the north, for I was now in the very heart of Yondo, where demons or phantoms might dwell who would not respect the sanctuary of the unbroken columns. Now, as I toiled on, the sunlight altered strangely for the red orb, nearing the mounded horizon, sank and smoldered in a belt of miasmal haze, where floating dust from all the shattered fanes and necropoli of Yondo was mixed with evil vapors coiling skyward from black enormous gulfs lying beyond the uttermost rim of the world. In that light, the entire waste, the rounded mountains, the serpentine hills, the lost cities were drenched with phantasmal and darkening scarlet. Then, out of the north, where shadows mustered, there came a curious figure, a tall man, fully caparisoned in chainmail, or rather, what I assumed to be a man. As the figure approached me, clanking dismally at each step on the sharded ground, I saw that its armor was of brass mottled with verdigris, and a casque of the same metal, furnished with coiling horns and a serrate comb, rose high above its head. I say its head, for the sunset was darkening, and I could not see clearly in any distance. But when the apparition came abreast, I perceived that there was no face beneath the brows of that bizarre helmet, whose empty edges were outlined for a moment against the smoldering light. Then the figure passed on, still clanking dismally, and vanished. But on its heels, ere the sunset faded, there came a second apparition, striding with incredible strides, and halting when it loomed almost upon me in the red twilight. The monstrous mummy of some ancient king, still crowned with untarnished gold, but turning to my gaze a visage that more than time or the worm had wasted. Broken swathings flapped about the skeleton legs, and above the crown was set with sapphires and ballast rubies. A black something swayed and nodded horribly, but for an instant I did not dream what it was. Then in its middle 2 oblique and scarlet eyes opened and glowed like hellish coals, and 2 ophidian fangs glittered in an ape-like mouth. A squat, furless, shapeless head on a neck of disproportionate extent leaned unspeakably down and whispered in the mummy's ear. Then with one stride, the titanic lich took half the distance between us. From out the folds of the tattered cerecloth a gaunt arm arose, and fleshless, taloned fingers laden with glowering gems reached out and fumbled for my throat. Back through aeons of madness and dread. In a prone, precipitate flight, I ran from those fumbling fingers that hung always on the dusk behind me. Back forever, unthinking, unhesitating, to all the abominations I had left. Back in the thickening twilight toward the nameless and sharded ruins, the haunted lake, the fortress of evil cacti, and the cruel and cynical inquisitors of Ong who awaited my return. Whew! All right. What you gonna do? Hello. So, that was to reset. Those who stuck through that, appreciate it. That was The Abominations of Yondo by Clark Asthon Smith. So, what I thought I would do with this, and I'm, as always, willing to go wherever the conversation goes, is really look at this. You have a story. Again, though, right, it's barely a story. I would even hesitate to call it a story because it's really nothing. There's no real plot to it. It is simply a guy shows up in a place, starts moving through it, kind of runs, right? There's no real, I don't know, obstacles. There's no real purpose. I would hesitate to even call it a plot, right? It's a series of these moments. Fluffy the Griffin says, "Holy purple prose, Batman." Yes, indeed. But out of that purple prose and out of these things can come a lot of inspiration. Now, in the first part of this, which I was kind of rereading it this morning, I was highlighting stuff, but I didn't get to finish it. So you notice, if you followed me through there, you'll notice that my highlights kind of stopped. But I think when we're looking for, right, what can we tease out of this story that might fit our games? And granted, we could take things just out of whole cloth, right? We've got this Desert of Yondo. You could drop it in somewhere. It's kind of crazy and amazing and alien, and it's definitely weird that you could put in there. But even if you didn't want to, from whole cloth, drop the Desert of Yondo into your game, I think there's all kinds of elements out of this that we can use for our own descriptions when we're looking for ways to describe things in a fresh way. I mean, I could almost highlight this entire thing. Right, blowing from a gulf no astronomer may hope to fathom. I mean, that's such wonderful language. I don't know if I'm at the point or at what point I could throw that on my players and my games tonight. So who knows? Maybe I'll try to find a way to throw it on them. But that's just just an amazing turn of phrase. I love the dark orb-like mountains, the pitted and wrinkled plains. I mean, this is all it's not even stuff I highlight. I haven't even gotten to my first highlighted text. But when we're looking for how can we keep things fresh, how can we find new language to describe a place? Because it can get, I know this happens, right? We have tons of forests, we have tons of hills, we have tons of mountains. We're always looking, well, how can we keep these different areas separate? Reading these kinds of stories, and really any kind of author that you appreciate that has a real touch for language, you can really get new stuff. Let's see. Roman Live says a freaky travelogue. Yeah, that's pretty much. It really is a travelogue, right? It's crazy and freaky for sure. But yeah, travelogue is probably a good way to describe the story. Let's see. Fluffy the Griffin says short, dense descriptions are good. I do like that, but you got to keep it short and sweet to hit home. Yes. You don't want to get too flowery. And the other thing is, of course, you have to remember that there's a difference. I think something to keep in mind whenever we're adapting stuff we see in fiction from stuff in the game is we have to remember that you don't want to put too much in terms of what the character's thinking, right? I want to leave it up to the characters to respond. So some of the stuff which, my heart shrank from whatever, or it's more than my eyes could bear. I want to be careful because it's nice and flowery, but it's also, we're kind of pulling some of that agency of characters and how they want to feel about it. Maybe these characters don't want to be scared out of their boots or whatever it happens to. Maybe they want to feel about it a different way, right? I want to leave that to them. You tell me how your characters are reacting. And sometimes with these descriptions, they will cross that line, which is fine when you're an author, because this is this person's point of view. This is his travelogue that this character has written. Theoretically, we're finding his story. So from that standpoint, you go, oh, yeah, he can say that stuff. But when we're taking this as a GM, you want to be careful of not impinging too much on your characters and kind of how let the players dictate how their characters want to respond or how they feel about it. But you can be sure to prompt them for things. I love this. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by the watchful gods of all proper and well-ordered lands. I mean, there's just so much stuff in there. I want to know, imagine, what is nether space? It's this weird thing, because it's like they have this whole sci-fi kind of fantasy mash in here, because we're talking about asteroids and, a gulf no astronomer may hope to fathom. Here we have nether space and the term incursion, which I always think of as a science fiction term rather than a fantasy term. But just in that one, not even the whole sentence is just crazy. Fluffy the Griffin says, I love Matt Mercer's description of scenes, but he crosses the agency line with a lot and tells characters how they feel. That's a line I won't cross. Yeah, I mean, I think when we're dealing with, we're dealing with, these videos, these kind of streams that are, these live play performances right there. They are performance and they are game. And I think that there's probably some behind the scenes, right? Some agreements as to it. And of course, Matt Mercer knows his players and everything. But yeah, I kind of feel like I will step back and then allow the players to come in. Now, sometimes that can lead to not as fun experiences because some players are going to be like, nope, my guy is, he's firm as a statue. He's never flinching, never fleeing, which is boring. But that's some people. That's how they want to play. That is their fantasy, to play someone who isn't fearful, who laughs at danger. Right? I laugh at your superior intellect. So maybe not as fun overall, but I'd rather them. Hey, if that's what you want to play, play it. None Nothing says, I'll call something a fearful sight, but not you are fearful. Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Or you could talk about how that would bring fear in others, or, and this is another place where if you have hirelings or other NPCs about, you can use them, right? You could talk about how the torchbearer's eyes go wide in terror when something happens, or some other, or their actions, right? So you can use them as your tools to convey that while still letting the player characters play their characters the way they want to. So just on this page, we have decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. I mean, decrepit demons, the fact that they're from a hell that's antiquated. I mean, an antiquated hell just to me is just hilarious. Is it a hell that's just outlived this person? It's sort of almost vestigial. Like, that was like the 10th hell. Doesn't really fit because we went to our 9 hell, went to the 9 hell standard. And so this 10th hell, it's just kind of there, forgotten. And these demons of that 10th hell were sort of just shunted off into some other spot when they closed the doors. That's just a great, I feel like a great phrase. We've got a cactus forest, which is interesting because I don't really think of cacti being plants that would be in forests. Usually the images of one lone cacti popping up out of the desert, but here we have a forest. So that's definitely an interesting location. The Inquisitors of Ong, we don't get a whole lot about what Ong is or where Ong is or what's happening in Ong, but they have these Inquisitors. So you imagine some kind of religious society. And I love just the hints. Whatever this place Ong is, there's a lot of hints going on about it. We've got swollen fulvus dying in half-rotten growths. I think I had to look up fulvus before, and I don't remember what it was. So what is... it's downloading. All right, well, as we're waiting for the Oxford American to download, here we go. Fulvus. Okay, reddish, yellow, tawny. And it's something that I like here. You don't want to get too much with these. You find, as I was reading through this, and something, if you were listening, he's got a lot of different great words for different colors. And it's certainly, I think, useful to move beyond just the kind of Crayola. Oh, it's orange, or it's red, or it's orangey red, reddish orange. There's all kinds of great colors. But, of course, particularly when you're using descriptions, if you use a bunch of words nobody's heard of, you're going to lose the effect. So in this case, right, maybe I would say use, orange or something like that. Because fulvus, it sounds amazing, but I can just see my players not really knowing what they are. But the idea of that the sort of growths are half rotten and swollen. I mean, just wonderfully visual words. And when a lot of times we're trying to describe places, creatures, right? We want these things that really put a great visual into the players' minds and into our own minds. Those are some great words. I don't know. I just like shapes of abomination, scarcely to be described. That's a great way to describe something in a way without describing it, because you're not really saying anything about what those shapes are, but you're basically allowing everyone's information to say what that is. So each player, if you said something like they bore abominable shapes, each player might have in their own mind, what does it mean that it's abominable, right? But it's going to be a visually arresting in their brains. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, this is kind of weird, even though each individual player and the GMU as well might have totally different ideas of what an abominable shape is. It's going to be really, it's going to be attention grabbing. Roman Live says, decrepit demons of the 10th hell, a new monster codex. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They will beg for souls. Leprous lichens, I think is a great one. Stagnant odors of decay, kind of classic, but it's always good. Here's more good use of different words for color. Eyes of bright ochre. I like the monstrous fungi here. The stems are hueless, but they have nodding heads of poisonous mauve, a more great color. The sodden lips of fetid tarns. A tarn is I think it's like a lake, or, let me highlight it. think it's like a lake or a pond, a small mountain lake. So it's another great way if you're looking for, go back. If you're looking for different ways to describe little bodies of water, Tarn is a nice one. Fluffy the Griffin says the Valley of Tehuacan Cuicatlan is a real cactus forest, and it's a sight to behold. Breathtaking. Oh, cool. I didn't know that. I wonder if Clark Asthon Smith knew it or if he just, made it up. I've seen palm forest in Morocco. There's a palm forest, which is kind of cool. But I hadn't seen a cactus forest. But it sounds amazing. I'll have to look up some pictures of it. Let's see what else we have here. So, okay, the monstrous fungi, sinister ripples. That's another way you can bring in, right? If you have something that's happening, in this case in water, you can convey some attitude to what's happening. So you could have said, well, the water has ripples, but by saying it has a sinister ripple, right? You're adding a character, it really is some information because you're clearly transmitting that this is not. It's not, it's what kind of, does this pose a danger? It's almost like you're giving them sort of a little bit of that. What does your intuition say about it? Okay, it's a pond. There are ripples on the pond, but it's almost giving you that sense of dread. And by giving them that sense of dread in that description, you're giving them info. It really is information. It's data because you are suggesting that this is not a good spot. And I think that's a great way to do it. I wouldn't waste it. I wouldn't just start using it places where it doesn't. Because here, I think if you're going to use those kinds of adjectives and things, I think it should be meaningful and let that be ways that your players can pick up. But it's definitely a way of transmitting things about it without saying, oh, someone wants to, ripples on a pond. Oh, I want to roll whatever to see if I feel scared about it. How do I feel about it? You can use that language to build it right in there. How do you feel about the ripples are sinister? That tells you kind of all you need to know about how you're feeling about it. The water, it's yellow water, which again is a great image. Okay, you can insert your pee jokes if you want, but certainly the fact that the water isn't a clear color tells you something about it and makes it also that strange, weird, and not right, which of course this whole place is not right. The cacti are blotched and sickly. Great things. I love that the sand is ashen because we're getting into this whole idea of it's ruined. So we think about if we were going to put this in, say, a hex map, right? And we wanted to have this hex is this desert. And we're going to fill it with all this stuff that's come up in the story. So it's going to be ruins and it's going to be undead and ghosts. We think of ruins, we think of destruction, fire, ash. And so the fact that the sand is ashen is setting the tone for what's coming. It's that way of building context. You want to try to give your party hints about, okay, this is a place, you've heard about it, it's bad news. You just thought it was stories, but okay, you get to the edge of it and the sand is ashen. Whoa, okay. These bits of water on the edge of it, the water's yellowed and it's the cacti are bloated and sickly, right? All this stuff is giving this context about the place that hopefully will pay off once they're into it. And I think it pays off in this story as in terms of what the narrator sees inside this place. I like the Dreadful Magicians and Mysteriarchs. Mysteriarchs. I don't know what a Mysteriarch is. I imagine maybe like a mystery religion, kind of the heads of a mystery religion would be a Mysteriarch. I'm not sure. I like the lion-headed Ong. I don't know what that means. Do they wear headdresses of lions? Are they legit just lion-headed creatures? Also just great in terms of, I would love to throw the Mysteriarchs and Inquisitors and have this kind of place of Ong. It sounds really cool. It sounds like a place I don't want to visit, but I would run a game there. Oh yeah, and just more racks of dragon gut strewn with powdered adamant. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. Obviously, I'm guessing that the racks, in this case, what do they mean by adamant? Because I always think of like adamantium. Legendary, okay, so it is like adamantium, so basically. Okay. Legendary rock or mineral. I'm guessing that that's just to make it scratchy. Strewn with powdered adamant. The fact that the ropes of the rack are dragon gut. And in this kind of universe, it's potentially that it is actually dragon gut as opposed to just being a turn of phrase for something else. The image of bloated corpse worms crawling in by the hundreds is just disgusting. And I could definitely use that in a scene. So getting back to the desert, we get a little bit of that background, and it, in an adventure setting, in a game setting, this would probably be stuff that would come up before we get to the desert, right? Where we might talk about people, whoever lives near there, talking about folks who have returned, the few who do return, babbling about stuff. But of course, there's also the treasure, which I think is nice because it's kind of like a plot hook. Oh, the horrors are horrible, and my hair is white, and I'm shaking on a palsy, but there's strange treasure. Nothing says, when I have emotion influencing magic, I try not to tell the players their emotions. I just change my descriptions. Sinister ripples. Nope, it's just you. That's a good idea too. Absolutely. I like it. Nothing. I like the long-legged insects as well. The color of a week-old corpse, which again is not an actual color that I can imagine. I have not, thankfully, knock on wood, I have not seen any week-old corpses, but my imagination will paint that for me. So even though you could tell your characters, oh yeah, those insects, they're the color of week-old corpses, it's going to say a lot with saying a little. And those are kind of great descriptions because they just say so much that they give the tone, in this case, kind of a horror weirdness, but you don't have to come up with it. You don't have to say purplish blue or I don't know, whatever, right? We're not talking about the ethnicity of the corpse. We're not talking about it's gone black or blue, whatever, from being out for ages. It's just a week old. And in your brain, each person will think of in their brain whatever that they feel like a week old corpse color is. And it's just perfect. A mephitic stench. Now I know what a mephit is in terms of monsters, but I'm not sure. Mephitic. It's a gas or vapor, foul smelling, noxious. So great, a wonderful word, and I will put it in my word dictionary. But probably, I would change that to noxious, just so that I know I am understood. But he uses nauseous right there. That might be why he doesn't. Oh, I like the low treeless hills, like the backs of half-buried monsters. Again, just says so much about the nightmarishness of the scene, right? We're hex crawling through here. Maybe this is somewhat in the middle of our campaign. We've seen tons of hills. We've used different things here. Part of that context, this place is dreadful, so everything appears dreadful. So they're not just treeless and low, but they actually feel like they're these are half buried monsters whose backs are just hanging out in the open air. And then the great pits. The jewels are interesting. I can imagine something like that will be an interesting feature. I wonder in a game terms if there were all these pits with kind of jewels in them, like what might they signify? And I would want to think of, thinking about what would be the, I feel like stuff like that just laying out in the sand is not, free jewels because you came to the desert. No, I'd want there to be some kind of defense or there's some reason why the stuff people haven't just come to the edge and mined all this stuff. So I don't know what would be in those craters that might be stopping folks from just picking up jewels or entice them to come down and get them and then get swallowed whole. Let's see. Fluffy the Griffin said, also got to take account of your audience. I used verdigris in the description of tarnished bronze once, and no one at the table knew the word. Yes. So it's always good to look up the words, and if you're going to use them, if you don't know them, obviously if you're reading a story like this and you, like I'm doing, it's an awesome sounding word, but I'm not exactly sure what it means, look it up. And yeah, don't be afraid to make sure you have other words ready so that if you notice your party kind of giving you a look, like, that look of kind of a little bit of like, I'm not sure what he means. I'm not sure what you mean there, GM, that you can kind of fill it in because you want all that atmosphere and that all the things that these words can provide, but you don't want the meaning to be lost because that is important. I love this, the way that the ruins are described. Crumbling mausoleums with lichen blotted marble. The fat chameleons are cool too. Just cities that just seem to be just completely, not even just ruins like you might think it's something majestic, like, the walls or whatever. Like, no, it's just nothing is unbroken. It's just lapsing, collapsing, right? Rubbish heaps. It's not even a temple like we might think, the Acropolis is kind of standing, it's a shell. No, it's just trash now, right? He calls it a rubbish heap. Fallen gods frowning, or leering, which is a great image. You could just see these you can just imagine, right? These big potentially, Ozymandias kind of grandiose statues that are now crumbled, and maybe just the heads are just sitting amongst the ruin, and the looks they have are sort of these kind of aggressive looks, right? Frowning at him, leering at him, gives them a real active, right? It's not just that they're just passively there. Oh, it's just a statue in the ground. No, it's frowning at you. It's leering at you. And in game terms, it's really going to, I know if I was a player and I'm walking around and I'm seeing these kind of godlike statues are feel like they're looking at me, but not only looking at me, but looking at me with this sort of hostile intent, that would definitely, that would definitely give me pause. It would certainly raise the tension level. And it's just silent, right? Except we have hyenas somewhere that are laughing, adders in the thickets, right? These aren't random encounters necessarily. You can run them like that. The hyenas never come into view. The adders never come out of the thickets, but they're there. They're just making noise. And from a player perspective, right, we're getting into, my guy would be having, hand on his sword or on, bow out at the ready, because you don't know what's going to jump out from anything, right? But it again adds to that character. And hyenas, I don't know about adders, but right, hyenas are there. I think of them as oftentimes, they're either taking kills, right? They're being sort of what's the word, like vultures. They're being why am I spacing out on the word I'm looking for? Scavengers, or potentially taking down kind of the sick. So that it has that same kind of sense of what's going on here. Sort of, it's sick, it's dying. Here we have sort of scavenger type predators and adders. I guess the poisonous again speaks to this whole place is poisonous. So the choice of the creatures in here is reinforcing the theme, which is something you could think about if we were going to build a wandering monster list table for this area. Let's look at that theme, right? So we have ruin, kind of a weirdness, a sickness. Things are bloated, dying, and bloating. Again, something happens oftentimes with poisons. So, okay, adders, right? Hyenas, great. And besides the fact that they're kind of scavengers, they also have that kind of laughter, which is unsettling. So that kind of fits. So, right, look for creatures that fit the theme of an area and see if you can find ways to plug them in. Then we get to the weird lake that's dark and green with all the salt. And it's kind of like a sort of a perverted the Dead Sea, or like the Great Salt Lake in Utah, but there's still some liquid in it. And it stings when you touch it, so it's definitely not something you could drink, not something you could even use to wash your hands. It's that sort of, deadly or harmful. And here we have sepulchral silence, the mounded dust of timeless ruin. Again, it's great. Now here we hear the first of the encounters, right? If we're going to talk about, what encounters are happening here. The first one starts with that chuckle, which is similar to the hyenas. So you already have in the background, you've had the hyenas, but now you have something even worse, but it's still that kind of laughing, that mocking sound. Now I'm going to, talks about it being like the mirth of an idiotic demon, and we've already had that demon imagery. So I don't know if this thing, because there's a couple of things that he calls with a capital T. Someone let me know in the chat if you've encountered this before, if you've seen this in one of the monster manuals. Nothing occurred to me straight away, but I'm not a monster manual savant, so I could just not be thinking in the right. But here's the description. With all the rapidity of a nightmare, a monstrous thing emerged. It had a pale, hairless, egg-shaped body, large as that of a gravid she-goat, and this body was mounted on 9 wavering legs with many flanges, like the legs of some enormous spider. And then a little bit later, he talks about, 2 knife-like ears rose high above its head, and a thin, wrinkled snout hung down across its mouth, whose flabby lips, parted in that eternal chuckle, revealed rows of bat's teeth. I have no idea what this thing is. I think of something that almost seems like, again, they kind of, and what's interesting, and I don't know if it's a generational thing, because I think I feel like if you look now at stuff that's designed to be horrible or terrifying, you get kind of H.R. Geiger inspired stuff like Alien, chitinous things, and mouths and acid dripping, and the kind of weird egg heads. I feel like we get all kinds of stuff like that. This is something very different, right? It's kind of weirdly I think of it as being smooth because it's pale, hairless, the body like an egg. It's doesn't have any eyes. It's got kind of spider legs. It almost feels there's a mechanical element, wavering legs with many flanges, which I think of as kind of a mechanical a mechanism, right? And then it's got no eyes, but it's got this droopy snout over its mouth feel. I feel like this kind of, it has an anime feel to it. I'm trying to think of it. Definitely makes me feel like some anime thing that I've seen. I wish I could remember where. Let's see. Fluffy the Griffin says the 9 legs really set home the idea that it's an eldritch horror or abomination. Right. It's not an even number, right? It's got 9 long wavering legs. So how are those, even those? And then they don't describe how many are on one side and how many on the other side. It doesn't really matter. It's the fact that it's 9. It's not 8, not 12, it's not 4. It's 9. And it just seems, it talks about there are no eyes in its oddly sloping face. And then it goes and just drinks of the lake, right? So we've just established through this narrator, and which we could do with our party, you could establish this lake is no joke. Not only is it not going to quench your thirst, but even if you try to wash yourself in it, it literally stings you. It hurts you. You could even say take a point of damage. And look at this thing just comes out. It's all crazy weird, and it drinks of the lake like it's nothing. If you ever want to have that moment that's going to tell you, like, not only is this thing not right, but it's not to be trifled with, you have this thing that's like poison acid to you, and this thing just comes down and just gulps. Oh, thanks. Look. Like you get to totally demonstrate that. And you don't have to do it right at the expense of a character. Just having it come down and drinking of that lake like it's nothing. Look, if your players are wise, they're looking at that going, okay, this thing is no joke. And of course he has to run. He has to run like heck. Get the hell out of Dodge. Then we get the first of these kind of nightmare elements, which is a statue that seems to, he kind of turns away, or I don't even know, they don't even really describe it as he sees it the first time. I think it's when he turns. Let me see. So he runs, he sits for a minute, and he hears a scream, and then he thinks it's a woman, and he turns, and it's like this statue. Oh no, it's not a statue at this point. It's a woman, jumps to her, trying to help her, and then he realizes it's a statue. So it's almost, so a couple things going on here, right? So it's kind of part kind of ghost, or maybe some kind of ghost, but it's tied to that statue. And in game terms, I mean, there's no shortage of ways that we could turn this into a creature. Is it somebody that was petrified into a statue? That might speak to a lot about what kind of society was here. If you had statues that were petrified people, is it someone's spirit tied in the statue? Is it the nature of the statue? Is this a statue of one of those gods who's now trapped in the statue? Like, I don't know, but it is freaky when you go to and I think in terms, especially in this time frame, I think giving it a woman scream as opposed to a man scream makes it, for the narrator, and I think for the audience at the time, or at least the male audience at the time, right? Oh, I want to save them. And so it adds that shock of like, oh my gosh, I can't save them. But we can see how having these things scattered around, it's atmospheric. Maybe you'd want to add more, add more mechanics to it. But it's certainly something else it really does add to that atmosphere of just it being unsettling. Of course, he runs away again. And now we have this shadow, and they don't describe what the thing is, just the shadow, which is kind of cool also. We can think about the party, something is keeping pace with them. They don't see it, they just see its shadow on the sands. And much like that other creature, as Fluffy the Griffin pointed out, is an abomination, this one is too. We've got a grotesquely elongated head, a squat body that is too gibbous or gibbous. And I'm trying to think of, in this case, what gibbous means. Yeah, because I know about the moon. Convex or protuberant. So it's got a convex kind of body is too convex. I'm just going to highlight this. There we go. Squat body that's kind of oddly convex. It's grossly elongated, and again, like Fluffy the Griffin pointed out, with the other creature, right? 5 legs, and you can't tell whether what's a tail or another appendage, but not an even number. Clearly an abomination, and you don't even see it; you just see its shadow. And yet, no matter how much you're doing, this thing is, is running with you. And now he gets to the circle of columns that are, we don't really learn why, but the columns that are still standing. And he talks about the odor. And remember, I've mentioned this in some of my other, videos. When you want to try to pull in as many of the senses as you can, and he does a nice job with going back to the colors they use. And here we have and different smells, and of course the sights, like the colors, the sights, and then the hearing, the adder, the silence, the laughing, and there we have again another odor, and he describes it as bats who've been in a charnel house. But we could think of other language. And he's on the run, and then he comes to the circle of pillars that is somehow unbroken. That the beast comes around, but the shadow thing comes in, doesn't fight them. I mean, you notice from these kind of stories, right? The hero here is not a fighting man. I mean, this is kind of in that H.P. Lovecraft, or I guess he's prior to H.P. Lovecraft, but similar vein of heroes who all they can do is kind of run screaming, and hopefully survive. So from a game perspective, we don't really have some idea how we would stat up this creature. It's in the fiction, it's not meant to be fought. I never feel like you should create encounters that are not meant to be fought. I mean, it might be overpowering, in which case, like a dragon shows up, unless your party is at the level which they can face a dragon, clearly it's in the party's best interest to run. But for my money, a dragon shows up because the dragon's going to show up, not because I want to scare the party away. I don't know for this kind of shadow thing how I would deal with it or how I would stat it up, but I feel like I should have something, because in the game, there's a chance your party's going to turn around and say, "How about you?" And then what happens? But you can definitely use a lot of language to try to, to say to your party, like, "Man, this is right. This is beyond your pay scale." But here we don't have any kind of idea what it can actually do, other than it can't get into this space. And it's kind of interesting that they gave him this space. I think from a fictional standpoint, you need some kind of space just to give the author a way to breathe and just look around, because at some point you go, well, how is he ever going to stop for a minute? And there's more stuff the author wants to say, so he's got to stop. From a game perspective, I want to think about, why is this particular circle unbroken? What does this circle do? Who made it? Is it part of the same civilization that he's just been running through the ruins? Is there something written on here? Is there some kind of glyphs? Like, why is this safe? Is it a place that has been consecrated? What's going on? And I think your players would want to figure it out. So it's a really neat idea having here, you have this nightmare terrain and here's this one safe spot. But I want to think about why it's safe. And is there a cost associated? What is the consequence of it being safe? Are you making some kind of implicit deal with some force by taking shelter in their space? And then we get to a couple of other figures. So first we get the man in chainmail, who is obviously not right. Oops, I wanted to highlight over here. Let's see. I'll read it. I'm just going to highlight it first. So definitely an interesting figure. A tall man, fully caparisoned in chainmail, or rather what I assumed to be a man. As the figure approached me, clanking dismally at each step on the sharded ground, I saw that its armor was of brass modeled with verdigris, and a casque of the same metal, furnished with coiling horns and a serrate comb, rose high above its head. I say its head, for the sunset was darkening, I could not see clearly at any distance. But when the apparition came abreast, I perceived that there was no face beneath the brows of that bizarre helmet, whose empty edges were outlined for a moment against the smoldering light. So some kind of undead figure here. I think there are lots of things we can look up in a monster manual, or Fiend Folio for that matter, or any kind of thing, and find some kind of weird undead knight type creature. Clearly, it's in its own world. It's atmospheric. It doesn't care about the party. I like to throw stuff in there, stuff that's just kind of, particularly those kind of things that are they're clearly active. They're clearly malevolent, but they don't care about the party. I mean, this, we don't know if it's malevolent. I think the fact that it's kind of undead wandering around makes it seem like it probably is malevolent, but we don't know for sure. But it doesn't care about the guy. It's just doing its thing. In games, I like to throw those out there because there's that risk of, for the party, that whole conversation of, is it going to attack us? If it's going to attack us, maybe we can get the jump on it. But are we creating a fight we didn't have before if we jump on it, right? So that happened once where I had this undead creature that was it was stalking somebody else, another NPC. But it was on its way, and the party crossed paths with it, and it was waiting because it could only move around at night freely. So it had found this dark grove of trees, and it was just waiting for nightfall so it could move again. And it's just standing there perfectly still. And the party, one of the guys came up and was kind of poking around, looking at it. It didn't do anything. And there was a whole conversation with them about, is it going to turn to attack us? Is it trying to do something? Like, what should we do? It clearly did not look nice. It looked malevolent, and it is. What should we do about it? And they ended up attacking it. But it was an interesting thing of like, if we are going to attack it, we should try to get first shot in, which is a smart strategy. But if we get that first shot in and it wasn't meant to attack us, do we just create a conflict we didn't need that could potentially, kill us? So it was interesting. And then we get a second apparition, the monstrous mummy of some ancient king. So I'm just going to highlight this. Oh, I didn't. Let's see. Oh, and this is the Lich. I don't know. Does anyone know what the history of Liches is? Oh, I don't want to highlight Twilight. Thank you. Because they call it a Lich. I don't know what the history of Liches is in the game. Is this where Lich came from? Because I didn't pick the story thinking this is going to be where Lich comes in. I guess let me highlight it and see if the dictionary gives some idea. Okay, no, nothing found. I don't know whether he invented it in this story or in some other story. But this is really interesting because it's very different, I think, than what we might think of as a Lich. So I will read the description again to reset it. The monstrous mummy of some ancient king, still crowned with untarnished gold, but turning to my gaze a visage that more than time or the worm had wasted. Broken swathings flapped about the skeleton legs, and above the crown that was set with sapphires and ballast rubies, a black something swayed and nodded horribly. But for an instant I did not dream what it was. Then, in its middle, two oblique and scarlet eyes opened and glowed like hellish coals, and two ophidian fangs glittered in an ape-like mouth. A squat, furless, shapeless head on a neck of disproportionate extent leaned unspeakably down and whispered in the mummy's ear. Then, with one stride, the titanic Lich took half the distance between us. And from out the folds of the tattered seer cloth, a gaunt arm arose, and fleshless, taloned fingers laden with glowering gems reached out and fumbled for my throat. So a couple of things here. If I'm reading this correctly, let's see. Nothing says Lich is just an old English word for dead body. Okay. But does this mean is this where the idea of the Lich is some kind of undead monstrosity came up? Because here we clearly have not just a dead body, but it is animate. And in this case, if I'm reading this correctly, is controlled by an animator who is not the thing itself, which is maybe the really kind of creepy part. So you have this, if I'm reading this correctly, mummy of an ancient king, but then there's something on top of it, some form, squat, furless, shapeless head. Or first it's just like a blob. Let's see, what does he say exactly? A black something swayed and nodded horribly, like there's some kind of like mush, like a weird jelly or pudding on the top of it, and then sort of eyes and fangs kind of form out of it or appear, or he sees them, and then it just sort of leans down and whispers in the mummy's ear, and then it starts coming for them. So the Titanic Lich, I guess in this case, is referring to that kind of mummy, or maybe it's referring to them as a unit. But it's definitely really interesting because it isn't just a dead body. It isn't even just a monstrous dead body. It's this monstrous dead body that's got some weird, who knows what, because it's really barely a description about it. Just to me, it speaks to something just kind of globby that's just on its head, almost like Master Blaster, but not a small guy on top of a large man, but some kind of intelligent, who knows what, up there. And then, of course, he runs and back to the cynical, inquisitive Ong. So it turns out that, hey, it's 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 like a trap by the inquisitive Ong, who know that nobody in that desert is going to be able to get through it, so it's going to drive them back. Now, Google says that the original D&D rule set, the Lich was introduced in its first supplement, Greyhawk. Yeah, I wonder if there's anything that says, I'm just going to turn that off, where the Lich as an undead thing comes from. Maybe I got to look at John Peterson's Playing at the World to see what is going on there, because it's definitely really interesting. But I don't know. But that's cool. I mean, if that is where this kind of the sort of somewhat D&D-ish idea of the Lich comes from, that's cool, because it was kind of unexpected. Wasn't expecting to find that. I was really thinking more that maybe we'd figure out what that egg-like thing on 9 legs is. And I feel like it definitely feels like it's very reminiscent of the early illustrations, like in the original Dungeons and Dragons, where they would have these very simple kind of line drawings of creatures, almost like a beholder. But the egg, instead of having the tentacles, it's got legs. Maybe, and of course it has a face. So that is an Appendix N. This one was, Clark Asthon Smith. I hope you guys enjoyed it. To me, it was great to go through it and read it. Let me know if you kind of like these, because there are definitely lots of stories we can look at. I think a lot of them, particularly these older ones, they're short, so we can read them. I think for longer things, and maybe if I'm looking at, because I know there's some Fritz Lieber one that I want to look at that has, I think, where Cloakers, the creation, or the literary reference from Cloakers shows up in that one, because it's newer and I'm pretty sure it's not public domain. I think from fair use, I could probably read the blurb about Cloakers, but not the whole thing. And plus, it's a little bit longer also. But I hope I was able to take this, and we looked at kind of what things we can draw from it, pull into our game. How might we make kind of playable elements out of this stuff? How might we use the language that he uses, which is just so great, to use for our games. Yeah, that's it. Thanks everyone for hanging out. As usual, if you like this stuff, throw me the thumbs up. So show everyone that you like it, and helps the algorithms and all that yada yada. You can subscribe if you want to find out when stuff's coming. That also helps me out a lot. Let me know on Twitter or elsewhere what kind of stuff you'd like to talk about. I should be scheduling another one of these for tomorrow, so I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about yet on that score, but we'll see. So if you have ideas, shoot them over to me. Let me know. Fluffy the Griffin says, a lot of fantasy definitions started with D&D, like studded leather wasn't a thing until D&D. Yeah, though, and I think banded, I know in the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City, there's kind of some stuff that looks like banded mail. It's not exactly it, but I feel like that's probably maybe where the banded mail came, because I don't think like banded mail in terms of D&D or one of those, another one doesn't really exist in real life, but there's this kind of idea of stuff that's similar to banded mail that they probably took and simplified, but I might be mixing up which mail it is. But yeah, I know studded leather wasn't a thing, but it kind of makes sense, and surely years and years of Renfest leather workers who have been making studded mail couldn't possibly be wrong. So they've got that working for them. Have a great rest of your day, folks. Again, leave me some comments if you had any. I always try to check the comments on these. So if you missed the stream and you're watching this or listening to this later and you have comments, put them in the comment areas where you happen to find it. But have a great rest of your whenever. Game on. I'll talk to you later.